The city of Oakhaven was a sprawling metropolis of glass and steel. But to Julian Vane, it was merely a chessboard where he was the only player that mattered. At 34, Julian was the CEO of Vane Enterprises, a multi-billion-dollar conglomerate that specialized in aggressive land acquisition and luxury developments. He was a man carved from cold marble, handsome, impeccably dressed in charcoal gray Italian suits, and possessing eyes that held the chilling clarity of an Arctic winter. Julian's office sat on the 82nd floor, overlooking the historic district of the city. To others, those cobblestone streets and centuries-old brick buildings were heritage. To Julian, they were inefficiency. "The demolition permits for the St. Jude's sector are stalled, Julian," his assistant Marcus said tentatively, standing by the floor-to-ceiling windows. Julian didn't look up from his tablet. Stalled? By whom? A local community group. They claim the old chapel and the neighboring soup kitchen are historical landmarks. There's an old woman leading them, Sarah Jenkins. She's lived there for 50 years. Julian let out a short, sharp laugh that didn't reach his eyes. History is just a fancy word for things that have outlived their usefulness. Offer her double the market value. If she refuses, triple it. If she still refuses, find out who owns her mortgage. I want that block leveled by the end of the month. But, sir, the soup kitchen feeds hundreds of— Marcus, Julian interrupted, finally looking up. His gaze was like a physical weight. I don't pay you to have a conscience. I pay you to facilitate progress. Progress requires space. Now, get out. Julian Vane believed that money was the ultimate shield. He believed that power was the only universal language. He had forgotten his own humble beginnings in a small Midwestern town, the son of a school teacher who had died penniless. He had traded his soul for a seat at the top of the world, and he wore his arrogance like a suit of armor. That evening, Julian decided to visit the site himself. He wanted to see the obstacle with his own eyes. He drove his sleek black supercar into the heart of the historic district, the engine's roar echoing off the narrow walls. He stepped out onto the sidewalk, his polished shoes clicking against the uneven stones. In front of the St. Jude's chapel stood a small, frail-looking woman with silver hair tied in a neat bun. She was sweeping the steps. This was Sarah Jenkins. "Mrs. Jenkins, I presume?" Julian asked, his voice dripping with forced politeness. The woman stopped sweeping and looked at him. Her eyes were warm, filled with a depth of peace that Julian found deeply irritating. "And you must be Mr. Vane, the man who wants to turn this sanctuary into a parking garage for people who will never look at the sky." "I'm the man who is going to revitalize this dying neighborhood," Julian corrected. "I've sent you several offers. You're being stubborn, Sarah. This building is crumbling. It's a liability." "This building is a home," she replied softly. "It's where the broken find a meal, and the lonely find a hand to hold. You have so much, Julian. Yet you look at the world and see only what you can take. Your heart is a desert." Julian stepped closer, his shadow falling over her. "Save the poetry for the Sunday service. You have 48 hours to sign the papers, or I will ensure the city condemns this entire block. You'll leave with nothing." Sarah didn't flinch. Instead, she looked at him with a profound sense of pity. "You think you are the master of your fate because your bank account is full. But pride is a heavy crown, Julian. It blinds you to the storm until it's already upon you. There is a price for treading on the weak, a curse of your own making." "Is that a threat?" Julian sneered. "It's a prophecy," she whispered. Julian turned on his heel and walked back to his car, fuming. As he sped away, he glanced in his rearview mirror. The old woman was still standing there, her silhouette framed by the glowing stained glass of the chapel. Suddenly, a strange chill swept through the car, a coldness that didn't come from the air conditioner. The lights on his dashboard flickered for a split second, and the reflection in his mirror seemed to distort, making his own face look like a hollow, weathered mask. He blinked, and it was gone. Stress, he thought. Just stress. But that night, the dreams began. He wasn't in his penthouse. He was in a vast gray wasteland where the wind sounded like the crying of thousands of voices. He was searching for his tower, but every step he took made the ground beneath him crumble into dust. And in the distance, a silver-haired woman stood, holding a lantern that cast no light. When he woke up the next morning, the air in his apartment felt heavy. He went to the kitchen to pour a glass of water, but as he touched the crystal carafe, it shattered in his hand. He wasn't cut, but the water that spilled onto the floor turned black as ink before evaporating into a foul-smelling mist. Julian stared at his hands. They were trembling. He pushed the fear down, replacing it with anger. 48 hours, he muttered to the empty room. Then she's gone. He didn't know that the clock wasn't ticking for Sarah Jenkins. It was ticking for him. The foundation of his golden tower was about to turn to sand. The 48-hour ultimatum Julian had issued felt like a heavy weight. Not for Sarah Jenkins, but for the atmosphere within the Vane Enterprises headquarters. A strange malaise had begun to seep into the building. The air conditioning hummed with a discordant metallic screech, and the high-speed elevators frequently jerked to a halt between floors, leaving executives trapped in stifling darkness for minutes at a time. Julian, however, refused to acknowledge the omens. He spent the day in a frenzy of activity, shouting into his phone and demanding legal injunctions. He wanted Sarah Jenkins removed by force, if necessary. But as the sun began to dip below the horizon, casting long, blood-red shadows across his mahogany desk, the first true crack in his armor appeared. "Julian, we have a problem," Marcus said, entering the office without knocking. His face was ashen, his hands shaking as he held a tablet. "I told you not to interrupt me unless the demolition crew was on site," Julian snapped, not looking up. "The board of directors just called an emergency session," Marcus whispered. "The SEC has frozen our primary acquisition accounts. There are discrepancies, documents they claim were forged. Millions of dollars are unaccounted for." Julian finally looked up, a sneer curling his lip. "Nonsense. My accounts are airtight. This is a temporary glitch, a move by a competitor to stall the St. Jude's project." "It's not just the SEC, Julian," Marcus continued, his voice cracking. "The physical assets, they're failing. The Vane Plaza in Dubai? A sinkhole opened up under the foundation this morning. The luxury resort in the Maldives? It was hit by a freak rogue wave. Insurance is claiming force majeure. We're losing billions every hour." Julian stood up, his chair clattering against the glass wall. "I don't believe in coincidences. This is a coordinated attack. Get my legal team on the phone. Now." He grabbed his coat and headed for the private elevator. He needed to be on the ground to see the enemy he was fighting. As he stepped into the elevator, the lights flickered. For a moment, the mirrored walls of the lift didn't reflect the interior of a high-tech building. Instead, Julian saw the interior of a damp, rotting cellar. He smelled the scent of wet earth and old incense. He blinked, and the polished chrome returned, but his heart was hammering against his ribs like a trapped bird. When he reached the street, the city felt different. Usually, people moved out of Julian's way, sensing his power. Tonight, they bumped into him without a word of apology. A street performer's violin music sounded like a funeral dirge. He drove back to the St. Jude's district, his mind racing with damage control strategies. But as he turned the corner onto the cobblestone street, his supercar, a masterpiece of engineering, simply died. The engine didn't sputter. It just ceased to be. The lights went out, the electronic locks clicked shut, and Julian was trapped inside his own luxury cage. He beat his fists against the reinforced glass. Outside, the street was deserted, except for a single figure sitting on the steps of the chapel. It was Sarah. She wasn't sweeping today. She was just sitting, looking up at the moon. Panic, an emotion Julian hadn't felt since childhood, began to claw at his throat. He felt the air in the car getting thinner. He reached for his phone, but the screen was dead. Then he looked at his hands in the moonlight. His skin looked translucent, the veins underneath turning a dark, bruised purple. He felt a sharp, stinging pain in his chest. Not a heart attack, but a sensation of being hollowed out. Suddenly, the car door clicked open. Julian stumbled out onto the cold stones, gasping for air. He crawled toward the chapel, his expensive suit tearing against the ground. He reached the bottom step where Sarah sat. "What? What did you do to me?" He wheezed, looking up at her. Sarah looked down at him, her expression one of profound sadness rather than anger. "I did nothing, Julian. I told you pride is a heavy crown. You built your life on the suffering of others, on the ruins of people's dreams. You thought you were untouchable because you had gold. But gold is just a mineral of the earth, and the earth eventually claims its own." "Fix it," Julian demanded, though his voice was barely a whisper. "I'll give you the money. I'll build you 10 chapels. Just make this stop." "You still think in transactions," she said, shaking her head. "You cannot buy your way out of a spiritual debt. The curse you feel is simply the weight of your own choices returning to you. Every person you crushed, every family you displaced, every tear you ignored, they are all coming home to roost." At that moment, Julian's phone in his pocket vibrated once, a final dying spark of battery. He pulled it out. A news alert. Vane Enterprises declares bankruptcy. Julian Vane wanted for questioning. His empire had vanished in less than 24 hours. "I have nothing left," Julian sobbed, collapsing onto the steps. "On the contrary," Sarah said, standing up and placing a gentle hand on his shoulder. "For the first time in your life you are empty, and only an empty vessel can be filled with something new. But the path back is long, Julian. You must walk it in the shoes of those you despised." As she spoke, the world around Julian began to blur. The lights of the skyscrapers in the distance faded. The sound of the city died away. A thick gray fog rolled in from the river, swallowing the chapel, the street, and Julian himself. When he woke up, he wasn't on the steps. He was lying on a thin, stained mattress in a crowded room. The air smelled of cheap disinfectant and old soup. He looked at his clothes. They were rags. His hands were calloused and dirty. He was in the very soup kitchen he had tried to demolish, and on the wall was a mirror. The man looking back at him was unrecognizable, gaunt, gray-haired, and old. The curse of arrogance had taken his youth, his wealth, and his name. Now, the path to redemption was the only road left. Julian woke up to the sound of a heavy metal ladle clanging against a pot. The noise resonated in his skull like a funeral bell. He tried to sit up, but his muscles groaned with a fatigue he had never known. This wasn't the exhaustion of a long day in the boardroom. This was the bone-deep ache of a body that had been discarded by the world. He looked around the room. It was the basement of the St. Jude's Chapel, the very place he had called a liability just days ago. Dozens of men and women sat on rickety chairs, their faces etched with the same desperation he had once mocked. "Breakfast is served. Move it or lose it," a gruff voice shouted. Julian stood up, his legs wobbling. He caught his reflection in a cracked window pane. The man staring back was a ghost. His sharp jawline was hidden under a salt and pepper beard, and the fire in his eyes had been replaced by a hollow, haunted look. He was wearing a tattered flannel shirt and boots that had holes in the soles. He shuffled into the line, his stomach growling, a sensation so alien it felt like an insult. When he reached the front, a young volunteer plopped a scoop of watery oatmeal into a plastic bowl. "Move along, Pops," the volunteer said, not even looking him in the eye. Julian opened his mouth to bark a command, to tell this boy that he owned the very air he breathed. But the words died in his throat. He had no ID, no phone, no credit cards. He was Julian Vane, the ghost of a billionaire, and in this room, he was just another mouth to feed. He sat at a long table next to an old man who was meticulously cleaning his spectacles with a rag. "First time?" the old man asked without looking up. I don't belong here," Julian croaked. The old man chuckled, a dry, raspy sound. "Nobody thinks they belong here, son. We all had important lives once. I was a professor. The fellow over there was a master carpenter. Now we're just the debris of a fast-moving world. You look like you've seen a ghost." "I saw a woman," Julian whispered. "Sarah Jenkins." The old man froze. He slowly turned his head to look at Julian. "Sarah? She passed away 3 years ago, kid. The chapel's been run by a trust ever since." A cold sweat broke out on Julian's brow. 3 years ago? But he had spoken to her. He had felt the heat of her gaze. If Sarah was dead, then who, or what, had he encountered on those steps? The realization hit him like a physical blow. The curse wasn't a legal maneuver or a financial collapse. It was a divine intervention. He had been plucked out of his timeline and dropped into the reality he had created for others. Determined to find answers, Julian walked out of the soup kitchen and onto the streets. He headed toward the Vane Enterprises headquarters, the skyscraper that bore his name. But when he arrived, the name on the building wasn't Vane. The giant chrome letters read, St. Jude's Commons. The luxury tower he had planned was gone. In its place was a massive community center, a library, and low-income housing. People were laughing in the plaza. Children were playing around a fountain. He approached a security guard. "What happened to Vane Enterprises?" The guard looked at him with pity. Vane? That guy went missing decades ago after a massive fraud scandal. They say he went crazy and walked into the river. The city took the land and turned it into this. Best thing that ever happened to Oakhaven. Julian collapsed onto a stone bench. He was a man without a time, a man without a legacy. His golden tower had been erased as if it were a smudge on a chalkboard. For the next several weeks, Julian lived the life of the invisible. He swept streets for scraps of food. He slept in shelters where the air was thick with the smell of unwashed bodies. He felt the sting of the winter wind and the even sharper sting of being ignored by people in expensive suits who looked exactly like he used to look. One evening, while huddling under a bridge, he saw a group of teenagers harassing an elderly homeless woman. They were laughing, filming her with their phones as they kicked her meager belongings into the mud. Old Julian would have ignored it. He would have called them unproductive elements of society and driven past in his tinted limousine. But this Julian felt a white-hot spark of rage, not for himself, but for the injustice. He stood up, his joints popping, and grabbed a discarded wooden plank. "Leave her alone," he roared, his voice echoing under the bridge. The teenagers laughed. "Look at this old hobo. You want some too, old man?" Julian didn't back down. He stepped into the light, his eyes blazing with the flicker of his old authority. "I have seen empires fall, and kings turn to dust. You are nothing but children, playing with fire. Leave, now." There was something in his voice, a remnant of the power he once wielded, that made the boys hesitate. They muttered curses but eventually backed away into the shadows. Julian turned to the woman. He knelt in the mud and began picking up her scattered belongings. As he handed her a tattered photograph, their hands touched. A jolt of electricity surged through him. The woman looked up. Her eyes were familiar. They weren't Sarah's eyes, but they held the same warmth. "You've started to learn, Julian," she whispered. "Learn what?" he asked, his voice trembling. "That power isn't about how many people bow to you," she said, her voice shifting, sounding more like the wind than a human. "It's about how many people you are willing to stand up for when you have nothing to gain." As she spoke, the bridge around them began to dissolve into white light. The smell of the river was replaced by the scent of old incense and wax. Julian blinked. He was back on the steps of the St. Jude's chapel. But it wasn't the past, and it wasn't the future. The sun was rising, and the 48-hour deadline he had set for Sarah Jenkins was only minutes away. His supercar was parked at the curb. His expensive suit was pristine. But when he looked at his hands, he still felt the phantom calluses of a laborer. He looked up. Sarah Jenkins was standing at the top of the steps, holding her broom. "The sun is up, Mr. Vane," she said quietly. "Are the bulldozers coming?" Julian stood up, his legs heavy. He looked at the chapel, then at his car, then at the city skyline. The curse had been lifted, but the path was just beginning. Julian stood on the pavement, the morning air crisp against his face. The roar of the city beginning its daily grind felt different now. Less like a machine he controlled, and more like a symphony of individual lives, each with its own weight and worth. Sarah Jenkins remained at the top of the stone steps, her eyes searching his. For a long minute, Julian said nothing. He reached into his breast pocket and pulled out the legal documents. The demolition orders and the final eviction notices that would have erased this sanctuary from the map. With hands that no longer trembled with fear, but with a newfound resolve, Julian tore the papers in half, then again and again. He walked to a nearby trash bin and dropped the remnants of his arrogance inside. "The bulldozers are not coming, Sarah," Julian said, his voice carrying a resonance that startled even himself. "In fact, nothing is going to happen to this block without your blessing." Sarah's expression didn't shift into a smile of victory. Instead, she looked at him with a deep, knowing nod. "A man who tears down his own pride is a far better architect than one who builds skyscrapers, Julian." Julian didn't return to his office that morning. He ignored the frantic calls from Marcus and the angry pings from his board members. Instead, he drove to a quiet park near the river, the same place where, in his vision, he had been a forgotten ghost. He sat on a bench and watched a young father teaching his daughter to ride a bike. He watched an elderly couple sharing a sandwich. He was seeing the unproductive elements of society, and for the first time, he saw their beauty. When he finally walked into Vane Enterprises at noon, the atmosphere shifted. The employees, usually scurrying like frightened mice at his arrival, froze. Julian wasn't walking with his usual predatory stride. He stopped at the reception desk. "Elena," he said to the young woman behind the counter. He had never used her name before. He had always called her front desk. The girl blinked, terrified. "Yes, Mr. Vane?" "I noticed the elevator in the East Wing has been sticking. Get the maintenance crew a bonus if they can have it fixed by tonight. And Elena, take the rest of the day off. Your mother has been ill, hasn't she? Go spend time with her." Eleanor's mouth fell open. Julian didn't wait for a thank you. He headed for the boardroom. The meeting was already in progress. The directors were discussing the St. Jude's acquisition. As Julian entered, the room went silent. "Julian, finally," the chairman said. "We were just discussing the demolition schedule. We've secured the local police for the perimeter." "Cancel it," Julian interrupted, taking his seat at the head of the table. "I'm sorry?" "Cancel the demolition. Cancel the luxury condos. Cancel the parking garage. We are pivoting the St. Jude's project. We are going to fund the renovation of the chapel. We are going to build a medical clinic and a vocational training center next to the soup kitchen, and we are going to do it under the Vane Foundation, not as a for-profit venture." The silence in the room was deafening. Marcus, standing in the corner, looked like he had seen a miracle. "Julian, that's millions in projected revenue," one director protested. "The board won't approve a charity project of this scale. It's corporate suicide." Julian leaned forward, his eyes flashing with the ghost of his former intensity, but tempered by a new wisdom. "It's not suicide. It's an investment in the city that feeds us. If we only build for those who already have everything, we are building on sand. If we build for those who have nothing, we build a foundation that can survive any storm. If you don't like it, I will buy out your shares, personally." Over the next few months, the city watched in disbelief as the Shark of Oakhaven transformed. Julian was no longer seen in the society pages. He was seen in the dirt of construction sites, wearing a hard hat, working alongside the crews. He wasn't just signing checks. He was listening to the stories of the people the St. Jude's Commons would serve. He learned that the master carpenter he had met in his dream was a real man named Thomas, who had lost his shop to a Vane acquisition years ago. Julian tracked him down and hired him to lead the interior restoration of the chapel. However, redemption is rarely a smooth road. The financial hit from the pivot was massive. Competitors, sensing a sudden softness in Julian, began to circle like wolves. Hostile takeover bids were launched. His stock price plummeted. One night, sitting in his darkened office, Marcus walked in. "Julian, the board is moving to oust you tomorrow. They say you've lost your edge. They say the curse of Sarah Jenkins actually got to you." Julian looked at the city lights. He felt a flicker of the old fear, the fear of losing his tower. But then he remembered the soup kitchen, the cold wind under the bridge, and the weight of the silver-haired woman's hand on his shoulder. "Let them try," Julian said quietly. "They think my edge was my greed. They don't realize that for the first time I actually have something worth fighting for." He stood up and grabbed his coat. "I'm going to the chapel, Marcus. We're serving dinner tonight and they're short-staffed." As he left the building, Julian didn't look at the chrome letters of his name on the wall. He was looking at the horizon, where the first signs of a different kind of storm were gathering. A battle for the soul of his company. The morning of the board meeting arrived with a sky the color of bruised slate. Rain lashed against the glass of Vane Enterprises, a storm that seemed to mirror the turbulence within the company's walls. Julian sat in the back of his car, not looking at a tablet or a stock ticker, but at a small tattered photograph of Sarah Jenkins' chapel that he now kept in his pocket. As he entered the boardroom, the air was thick with hostility. The directors sat like judges at an execution. "Julian," the chairman began, his voice cold, "the numbers don't lie. Since you began this philanthropic crusade, our market valuation has dropped by 15%. Hostile bidders are at the gates. You have prioritized a crumbling chapel over our shareholders. We are moving for your immediate removal as CEO. Julian didn't sit down. He walked to the head of the table and placed his hands on the polished wood. He looked at each of them. Men he had once called friends. Men who shared his old hunger for nothing but more. "You're right," Julian said, his voice calm and steady. "The numbers don't lie, but they only tell half the story. You see a 15% drop in stock. I see a 500% increase in the local employment rate around St. Jude's. I see 300 veterans who now have a roof and a medical clinic. I see a city that no longer fears the name Vane, but trusts it." "Trust doesn't pay dividends, Julian," a director shouted. "Doesn't it?" Julian countered. "This morning, the city's largest labor union and the Teachers' Pension Fund contacted me. They have watched what we are doing at the Commons. They've decided to move their entire investment portfolios to Vane Enterprises, not because of our quarterly margins, but because we are the only firm in this city building for the long term. They aren't looking for a quick flip. They are looking for a legacy." He slid a folder across the table. "The hostile takeover bid you were so afraid of. It's dead. With the backing of the pension funds, I now hold 51% of the voting power. I'm not leaving, but many of you are." The room fell into a stunned silence. The shark hadn't lost his teeth. He had simply found a better reason to bite. By the end of the hour, the board had been purged of those who refused to see the vision. Julian walked out of the room, feeling a lightness in his chest that no amount of profit had ever provided. He went straight to his office and called Marcus. "Marcus, tell the crews at St. Jude's to double their pace. I want the vocational center open by the 1st of the month. And tell Thomas I want the stained glass in the sanctuary finished. I don't care about the cost. I want it to glow so bright it can be seen from the river." Years passed. Oakhaven changed. The St. Jude's Commons became the heart of the city, a place where the barrier between the elite and the forgotten had finally begun to crumble. Julian Vane was no longer the man in the silver tower. He was the man often seen sharing a meal at the soup kitchen or teaching a business class to young entrepreneurs from the housing project. One autumn evening, Julian walked to the chapel alone. The renovation was complete. The stone was scrubbed clean, and the bells rang out with a clear silver tone. He climbed the steps and saw a figure sitting in the shadows. His heart skipped a beat. For a moment he thought it was her, the silver-haired prophet who had broken him so that he could be made whole. But as he stepped closer, he realized it was a young woman, no more than 20, crying silently. Julian sat down next to her, keeping a respectful distance. He didn't offer money. He didn't offer a business card. "I've sat on these steps in the dark before," Julian said softly. "It feels like the world has ended, doesn't it?" The girl looked up, wiping her eyes. "I lost my job. My landlord locked me out. I have nowhere to go." Julian looked at the city lights. He remembered the cold floor of the basement and the smell of the river. He reached into his pocket and pulled out a small key, a key to the St. Jude's emergency housing wing. "There is a place for you here," Julian said. "Not as a charity case, but as a guest. We need people who know what it's like to struggle, because those are the only people who know how to truly build." The girl took the key, a flicker of hope igniting in her eyes. "Why are you helping me? Who are you?" Julian smiled, a genuine, warm smile that reached his eyes. The kind of smile the old Julian wouldn't have recognized. Just a man who learned that the only way to climb the highest mountain is to help others out of the deepest valley. As the girl walked toward the doors, Julian looked up at the moon. The air grew still. and for a fleeting second he smelled the scent of old incense and fresh earth. A soft breeze brushed past his ear, sounding remarkably like a whisper. "Well done, Julian." He looked at the top of the steps. No one was there, but a single worn broom was leaning against the stone wall. Julian Vane, the billionaire who was once cursed by his own arrogance, stood up and picked up the broom. He began to sweep the steps, his heart full, his debt paid, and his path finally home.